Hi, so welcome to the Bento Block of the Day 2020. How exciting! Whoever thought we'd reach year 2020 and do a Bento Block of the Day at the same time? So I would just like to welcome you into the program. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a tutorial this morning on how I'm doing all the applique. Many of you will want to do the same thing, some of you will want to do it a little bit differently, and that's absolutely fine. This is your quilt. So we're going to... You've already had all your notes about the prep for the backgrounds, and I'm suggesting that we do it that way. It's quite encouraging later on to only have to do the applique. Life gets busy, and if we've got to stop and start and with backgrounds and things as well, it might slow us down just a little bit more. If we're trying to make the whole quilt in the year, it's really good to try and keep up. This is not a pressure statement, but just to help you not to get too far behind, because then it gets a little bit too hard in our minds. Our minds are a little bit tricky things. However, so if you've got your backgrounds ready, I've got the background fabric just placed with the batting behind. I'm using the batting, A, because it's going to be a quilt, and also because it works as a stabiliser for the applique. Most often when you applique, whether you're hand appliquing, machine appliquing, whatever it is, it can cause the background fabric to scrunch a little bit sometimes without some sort of a stabiliser. You could use starch, you could put another different sort of stabiliser, you could put paper or tissue paper. There's lots of things you can do. I thought, seeing as we want batting anyway, we might as well use the batting. So I've got that behind, and I'm appliquing right through the batting. You can see my stitching on the back here. We could have put the backing piece of fabric behind as well, but I thought that it would be less stressful to have some of the little starting and stopping and little ends and things if they didn't show on the actual backing fabric. And we can come back later and do a little bit of quilting with the backing fabric on our row before we have the rows all put together. So we're just going to cut out our pieces, we're going to fuse them on, and we're going to stitch around. Now I've used a free motion machine stitch on mine. You may have a preferred method for your stitching, but I do suggest that you do it through the batting as well, because, as I said, that acts as a stabiliser. It won't scrunch and distort if you do something like that. So I'll go ahead and show you. You should by now have your notes for part one. So you had your welcome notes, you've had your prep notes, which was all about having the backgrounds ready, and now you've got part one. How exciting is that? So I've given you a picture of the blocks that we're going to be achieving in this part. As it happens, these 7 happen to form a nice little block in itself. However, that won't always be the case, because they're all a little bit different and they come out a little bit higgledy-piggledy. However, we will get there. And then all your shapes are here ready for you to trace. Everything is the size, should print the size it should be. There's a 1-inch square printed on your page so that you can check the measurement of that. It should measure 1 inch along the sides of 1 inch, obviously. I've also numbered each piece. And there's a little note there to remind you that the numbering indicates the placement of your pieces. So number 1 should go down on your background first, and then number 2, and then number 3, etc. Sometimes there's only one piece. Well, it's still number 1. It goes first. Sometimes there's a few more. When we're doing the little kokeshi dolls, most often, but not always, number 1 will be the face, because the face goes down first. If you think of it as a body, there's the flesh, then you put clothes on it. So we have the face, then we put the little neck piece on, which goes underneath the kimono type clothing. And so you can see that we're building from a body with clothing layers and things. So that's why the numbering is there. It also helps. Now some of these pieces, you'll overlap them. They're not the exact fit. They're intended that you can overlap the pieces to make it work. And you've got a photograph, you've got a diagram of how it will look. So I think you've got enough information there for you to be able to get that all together. So I'll get started on showing you how we're going to work. So I do suggest that you have some sort of a system. I've got my project bag. You may have a box, you may have something. I suggest that you keep everything that you're going to use together in that box. You might have some little tools and things, your fabrics. Now I've got my fabrics in a separate pouch. I've got a couple of applique mats. I've got my folder, and I keep another little pouch, which these could be kept in there, but because I do a lot on the run and want it to be a little bit more portable, I just keep things like my scissors, and I'm using some of these Pigma marking pens for the faces, which I'll show you shortly. I keep all of those for the project and my thread. So I've got a couple of colours of thread, the flesh colour and a dark grey that I use for all the applique. I would keep all of that together as part of the project so that every time you want to go to use it, to do anything with it, everything's there for you. So your fusible web, your pencil for tracing, your scissors, your marking pens, your threads, it's all in one place. How neat is that? So if you've got something like a project bag or container, that's great. Have your folder handy so that you've got your notes building in that, so that you've got something to refer to if you need to. So when I'm tracing for my shapes, so this is just a small portion, imitating the first part. This was our part 1 that we're doing up here. So as you can see, this is going to look very similar. I've just used some different colours. So I just thought I could show you how to get that first lot ready, and then following that, as I said, the technique will be mainly the same sort of thing, and if there's different things I will come back and tell you all about them. So I keep all my fabrics in here. I have my flesh coloured fabric, I have my hair black fabric for the dolls, and then I've got the strips that I had suggested that you could use if you wanted to. I'm using these strips for all the applique. And again, just another little comment, in most cases the strips are wide enough for our shapes. Sometimes it's a tight fit, and if they're not wide enough, I might just overlap them. Because it's batik and because we're fusing, a little overlap here and there won't matter. Everything we're doing today fits in, so that's not really going to be a problem. So as you can see, I've had little mice at my strips here because I'm still making mine. But that's how I store them. I've got a clip, I keep my strips together. I have already got mine ready to show you this morning for what we're doing today. So I've got some pieces here. Now the other thing I would suggest that you have handy is the applique mats. Now these are just a Teflon mat. Quite often they're sold as a cookie baking sheet, or they might be sold as an applique mat, who knows. It's basically the same thing. These work really well for a couple of things. They work really well to protect your ironing surface, so that when we're using the fusible web, if little bits and pieces like this one here, for example, well, in fact I can iron it while we're talking here. This one here is a little bit of a tight fit on a 2.5 inch wide strip, but it does just fit. But if you had little bits sticking over, you don't want them arriving onto your fusible web. So I've got it all traced onto my, I'm using steamer seam, so it's got the double-sided. I pull off the back side. If you draw and things onto the side with the grid, now I don't know if you can see the grid because it's only in a yellow colour here. The grid is actually printed on this side of the paper. This is the one to trace onto, so that you can just peel off the other side and we can position this one on here. So by using the applique mat, if anything sticks over in the way of little bits of fusible, and it's probably going to just a little bit, I don't want glue all over my ironing surface, so I can do it that way. And that's going to give me a nice little thing. And so if you get little bits of glue arriving on your ironing surface, when that's cooled, you can just rub those off. That will all come away. So you may find you're getting bits. I would suggest that you do clean it off as you use it, because you don't want little bits of glue getting onto the next piece of fabric you put there. So that's how I iron my shapes on. I trace onto the grid side. I've got a couple more here already ironed on, ready to show you, plus I've already done some, and I've ironed some on in place so that we didn't have to take all day doing everything. I have a couple of mats so that I can use one over here if I want to as well. Again, it protects your iron as well, so you can put one above and one below. You can have one on here when you're ironing if you want to. Just helps protect things a little bit. So I'm going to cut these out now. I've got my trusty scissors in here. I'm using these wonderful Perfect Scissors by Karen K. Buckley. I find them so good, but they've got the little serrated edge. That should go at the bottom. I often find I like the slightly larger size. And I'm just going to cut those out. Now I'm sure you know how to do this, but I figured I would just show you what I do anyway. So if I'm just cutting these out, just along the line or somewhere so that it resembles more or less. This particular shape here, this is a yuzu, which is like a citrus fruit that seems to be available in and grows in Japan. They are absolutely delicious. They're sort of somewhere between a lemon and a grapefruit and an orange, and I'm not really sure. Whatever it is, they taste really good. So I've got that cut out ready now, and just to get that paper off, I just flip that over and roll it a little bit, and I usually find that the paper part becomes available that you can then pull that off. So we can take that off, and then I'm going to position this, because I'm using the steamer seam, it's quite tacky, which means that you can pop it down and you can reposition it. So really good when we're doing little fiddly bits like the dolls, not so much on a single shape like that, it doesn't make so much difference, but I find it's a very good product for that reason. And then I've got another shape here, which I might as well get these on while we're here. This is just a circle. If you've got a nice decorative piece of fabric that would look nice in your circle, that would be great. If you haven't, just a nice piece of fabric looks great. Now, another thing, when you're positioning the shapes, on these internal blocks that we've got in here, you can see where your seams are going to be. Just remember, we're going to lose 1/4 inch all around the edges on anything that isn't joined inside. So come down 1/4 inch before you start thinking about where the centre of that is. You don't want it centred evenly, top and bottom, because you're going to lose 1/4 inch when we join the pieces up. So just bring it down a little bit so there's a little bit more of a gap up the top there. It should be sitting fairly evenly with each of those 3 seams and not so much with that top one in this case. And the same is going to apply down here. This is a little teapot and cup. I'll cut this out. I left this one to cut to show you, not so much for the cup, because I think the cup is fairly straightforward, but for the pot, because it's got a little handle with an opening, and I'll just show you what I do with that. So I cut the pot out. This is going to be such a fun project. I'm off to Japan again soon, hoping to go and visit, if I possibly can, someone that makes the kokeshi dolls, and see some other bits and pieces in Japan. It's always so interesting to go to other places and have a look at things. When I went last time, I went to a superb bamboo forest. Just absolutely amazing to walk in amongst all the tall, really super tall bamboo. Right, so this teapot's nearly cut out. So we'd like it better if there's a hole where the handle is, because it looks a little bit more like a handle that way. So instead of trying to cut a hole, and you can do it by cutting a little hole and manoeuvring around if you want to, what I often do is I actually cut up that little join line there, because we're using the fusible web, and I just cut inside and then I cut that out. And I just find that when I fuse it down, nobody knows that there's a little hole, little slit there, because when we're fusing that, and we'll do it now so that you can see what I mean. So we've got to fit the teapot and the cup in. Remember, we've got to have the extra little bit of seam allowance on this side. Just make sure that everything sits quite comfortably within your space. So position your teapot so that you're happy with where you've got it. And then for the handle, just make sure that when you position it and you iron it back in place, that it really just sits. Nobody will see that join. You don't have to do that, of course. You might prefer to do it differently. But I find that that works really well where there's little fiddly holes to get in and out of things. So now I've positioned all those on. I'm going to come over here to the iron, and I'm just actually going to place this on top. They're not going to move because I've got the sticky product there. I think that's all looking pretty good. If you're a little bit worried about things moving because you can't see with the mat here, you don't have to have the mat now. The other thing you can do with a mat like this is, if you've got multiple layers, particularly with things like the kokeshi dolls, you can assemble them onto your mat here, so that you could put your face down, then a little bit of clothing and another bit of clothing overlapped, so that you can build your whole picture or doll or whatever it is, and then you can peel it back off here. So you take all your paper off the back first, and it's all ready to then position the whole thing as a whole on there. So I'm just going to get rid of my rubbish here so that we don't get in too much of a mess. And if you're going to work on all 7, because we're going to get these patterns weekly, at once, then I suggest that you get all the little faces and things ready, and then you can do all the stitching with that colour. I only changed colour for the faces because I didn't think they looked really good with dark outlines on the faces. It kind of looks a little bit like chin hair or something, which isn't attractive necessarily. Otherwise I use, as I said, one colour only. So I'm going to go to the machine now. I've got my machine all set up for free motion stitching. I've dropped my feed teeth, I've got a free motion foot on, I've got my thread all on to do the face part. So all I'm going to do is a little bit of an outline around the faces, and then I'll do a little bit of the grey, but then I'll show you how to mark the faces, and then I think you'll know how to make the whole quilt. So this little girl down here, we actually placed the dark piece down before we did the face. This is one of the rare times when the face sits on top of the clothing. It's just only ever so slightly on that chin, and it's only a tiny little bit of stitching we have to do. However, I think it's good to do it, and I think it's good not to do it in a dark colour. So I'm just going to free motion stitch just along the bottom of that face there. Just take your time, don't have to be in a rush. Don't have to do it free motion. However, it's quite convenient once you get going on the free motion. You soon get used to the idea of how to control the free motion if you haven't been doing it. And I'm going to do these other couple while I'm here as well. So this one here comes across the bottom of the face, but she also goes down the neck just a little bit. So I would do that all in one go. So I'm going to come in here, and then I might just back up a little bit and come down. It's okay to double up over your stitching, especially when you've got a matching thread, and then just finish up under the chin there. And we've got another little one here, same, she's got a little neck as well. And there we've done the faces already. So I'll quickly just change thread just to do a little bit more stitching just to show you. So I've changed the thread on the sewing machine. I've got my dark grey in there now, and I'll just go around this little lady here. It may help you to have a look at your pattern pieces at the same time, because there are little crossover bits, and even though it's such a tiny detail, it's quite nice to have them marked. It's not essential if you don't want to go to that much detail. So I'm just going to come in here and start on the little collar. And I'm just going to come along. And that would cross over there, so I'm just going to do a little crossover. I can show you in detail in a minute. And then I'm going to just keep going. I don't have to keep stopping and starting. And this one comes all the way through. It's back up here. Down and do this little obi over here. And then I'm going to go onto her hair from there, so that I can just keep going where possible, not to keep stopping and starting all the time. And now I'm so close to here, I'm just going to skip down right next to the hair so that the stitching won't show, and then just finish off going around the kimono. Now you'll see that I'm not turning my fabric right around. I could on something like this, however we're normally going to be working on a much longer strip than I am, so I wanted to show you that you don't actually need to turn everything. come back up here and we're just about done. I'll just finish off just there. So I've stitched my little lady in there. So she's already got all her stitching. So on the back here you can see, oh, I had a little snag happening. Oh no, it's just a little bit of thread sitting there. So on the back you can see that it's not quite as tidy as we might like it to be, but it's absolutely fine. It's sitting nicely. It doesn't distort because the batting is sitting there. And now I'm just going to show you how to do the little faces. I won't stand here and show you all the stitching because I think you've got the hang of that now. So with the little faces, so on the pattern pieces they've got little eyes and mouths marked, and I'm going to suggest that you use the Pigma pens. These they're called a micron pen. They come in different sizes. So this is an 01, which is very fine. This is an these two are 05s, which are not quite as fine. I'd suggest that you stick with the 01s, 03s up to 05s and don't go larger because they can get a little bit heavy, which is not what we're after. I mostly use a black and maybe a brown, or I might use a red for the mouths. I use the black for the eyes, and I might use the brown and or red for the little mouths. So I was going to suggest that when you do the eyes, so you could have traced that on if you wanted to, if you're not too sure. A lot of it you can do really by eye. So if you're not sure where to put them without marking them, you could just try, these won't look quite right, but popping a couple of pins in just to see if that is the position that you think will be about right. By popping those pins in, you will actually have made a little tiny pinhole, which you'll be able to see as well. And then with the eyes, I'm just going to make two little lines. So you don't want the eyes up too close to her hair, you don't want them too far down, you know, there's all these things in life. And I'm just going to do a little line. Now I do suggest that you try these pens out on a piece of your fabric first to make sure it's not all going to run, because you don't want it running. They shouldn't run, and they should be permanent once they're in. So there's the two little eyes already, tiny little eyes. Don't make them too heavy because it will become a little bit overpowering. Go lighter. It's better to try and come back and add a little bit more if you need a little bit more later on. And then for the mouth, I most likely would just do a little tiny dot of maybe a brown, maybe a little bit of red and brown even. So I would just a little dot there, and maybe just a little, take away some of the brightness and pop a little bit of brown over the top. And I think that's really all you need to do their little faces. Each time you can vary them slightly. They can look a little bit different, they could be a little bit more smiley, they could be all sorts of things, or they can just be little faces. So I'd suggest that you do the faces fairly light, as I said, lightly first. If you think it's not quite heavy enough, come back and do it again. You can iron that just to heat set it, although it will just dry permanently. Any stitching lines that we're going to do are marked on your pattern pieces. So on the table here you might want to stitch the table legs and things. If you look at my piece up here, which is already stitched, although it's probably not easy to see that level of detail in the photos, but where there's some detail, I've done it as a stitching line. You may want to make it a little bit heavier, you might want a darker thread than I'm using. There's any number of different things that you can do to make it yours, but a little bit of detail with some stitching around it works really well. So always stitch all your raw edges and then add some detail with just some stitching lines, and those lines will always be marked in your pattern as a suggestion for you. And where this little kimono on this little lady is here, for instance, that's indicating there's a line that comes down here because it's like a little overlap of the kimono, and then this little bright yellow piece here is like a little fastening over that. So it's just making sure that the clothing looks a little bit like clothing, and that's one of the reasons I use a darker thread so that it stands out a little bit to give you those outlines. Other than that, I think we're done. We've got our pattern, we've got our fusible. Oh, I was just going to show you on the long piece, when we're working, if you're working on the long strip as I have suggested that we do, you're going to say, well, how do I fit all that in my machine? Well, it's very simple. You simply roll up. If you're working on the beginning, like we're just doing to get started, you can just roll it up. You can put a couple of clips in if you like, but you can work on that in your machine quite satisfactorily to do your free motion. And when you're further along, of course, the same thing, you can just roll it from both edges. If you put a couple of the clips in that will hold, it will sit nicely for you so that you can work within those areas there. So I think that that should take away any little problems in that area. If you haven't done free motion stitching before and would like to, I suggest you do a little bit of practice before you go onto your quilt, but only a little bit. Don't panic about it. Most people are not going to come out with a magnifying glass and inspect your stitching. It will all be just amazing when it's all done. So thank you for coming and joining in with doing this. I do hope you're going to enjoy it. If it seems a little daunting at the moment, it will get easier as you get into it. So please do join the Facebook group if you haven't and you'd like to, just to see what others are chatting about. It's often very helpful. If not, that's fine. And please email me if you have any questions. Email is the best way to get hold of me. So thank you and enjoy your bento block of the day.